It's the biggest stories of the week. An officer involved in 2 police killings and several other controversies calls it quits after being arrested on sex charges involving a teenager. The multi-million-dollar bill comes due for the defense of 2 former JEA executives. The police union accuses the mayor of slow-walking pay raises, and the state moves to disconnect kids from their cell phones. We're talking about all that and more with our Friday Week in Review panel. And how one rapper turned flautist is changing the new age and jazz landscapes. Join the conversation. Give us a call at 904-549-2937 or send an email to firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. You can also message us on Facebook, Instagram, or X. It's all ahead this hour after the day's news.
And you're listening to WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Good morning. I'm Stephen Ponson. It's now 9:01. The Florida Supreme Court is yet to release its opinion about whether proposed constitutional amendments on abortion rights and recreational marijuana will go on the November ballot, but it does plan to release those opinions Monday afternoon. Florida Attorney General Ashley Moody has argued the amendments should not be allowed to go before voters. Governor Ron DeSantis addressed the issue Thursday.
Our Attorney General, I think, has handled that very ably, and I think that she's made arguments that have been very compelling. So we'll have to see what ends up happening, and then we'll go from there.
Florida's High Court is required to sign off on the legality of the wording of proposed constitutional amendments before the measures can be printed on the ballot. Opening day is here for the Jacksonville Jumbo Shrimp. The team's 2024 season starts today at 1-1 Financial Ballpark against the Gwinnett Stripers, the AAA affiliate of the Atlanta Braves. The team is celebrating its home opener by closing A. Philip Randolph Street and hosting a street carnival with a rock wall, games, and more. Other special events during the 3-game series include a T-shirt giveaway on Saturday and an Easter egg hunt before the game on Sunday. First pitch tonight is set for 7:05, and tickets start at just $5. Today in Jacksonville, we're going to have highs in the upper 60s. It'll be breezy with wind gusts up to 24 miles per hour at times. Tonight, clear skies with lows in the upper 40s. This weekend, sunny skies throughout the weekend and no rain in the forecast with gradually warming temperatures each day. Saturday, it'll be sunny with highs in the upper 70s. And then on Sunday, highs will be in the lower 80s. Tomorrow night, lows will be in the mid-50s under clear skies. And then on Sunday, lows in the upper 50s. Next chance for rain next week will be in the middle portion of the week. You're listening to WJCT News 89.9.
This is WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Opinions expressed on the First Coast Week in Review are those of our panelists and do not necessarily reflect the views of WJCT News 89.9.
Good morning. I'm Ann Schindler, and it's Friday, which means it's time for our First Coast Week in Review. Among our topics, a police officer in a high-profile police killing calls it quits after being charged with lewd conduct with a minor. JEA's insurance firm is footing the bill for 2 ousted executives' legal defense. The police union is pushing for a pay raise, saying officers are vastly underpaid. And a social media ban and cell phone restrictions could dial back access for teens in Florida and on the First Coast. To talk about all that and more, I'm joined by First Coast News evening anchor Anthony Austin. Good morning, Anthony.
Good morning, Ann.
Thanks for getting up early.
No problem.
Florida Times Union Metro columnist Nate Monroe. Hey, Nate.
Hey, Ann. Good morning.
Thanks for getting up early, too.
Yeah.
Glad to
Happy
have
to
you.
do it.
Florida Politics Capital reporter in Jacksonville Today columnist A.G. Gankarski. Hi, A.G.
Hi, Ann.
And Action News investigative reporter and anchor Emily Turner. Hey, Emily, welcome back.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Happy to have you. We are also going to take your calls and questions about the week's biggest headlines. You can give us a ring at 904-549-2937. You can reach out on social media, or you can send us an email to firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. Let's start with a headline that has really stunned some locally. Anthony, an officer involved in one of the city's most controversial and closely scrutinized police shootings in recent memory, was arrested for alleged sex crimes. Catch us up on where we are, how we got here.
Yeah, and this is a name that I think most of us are all familiar with, Josue
Garriga. So the news broke on Wednesday. I believe it was Wednesday evening. We received some information from the Clay County Sheriff's Office that he was actually arrested on charges of sex crimes involving a minor. So what we know is that he met this victim, a 17-year-old girl, at church and actually suggested that she download the WhatsApp to speak with him. So when they did this, according to the Clay County Sheriff's Office, he actually used the application to send nude photos and even asked this girl of photos of herself, according to the Clay County Sheriff's Office. And they actually found 305 interactions between Garriga and this 17-year-old girl. So the victim, she actually told police that she met Garriga at a Clay County business, not specified exactly by police, but we know that there was video of that encounter captured both inside and outside of the business of them together. But what's interesting about this case, as I mentioned, this is a name that we're all familiar with because you may remember that he is the officer who fatally shot FAMU student Jamie Johnson. He was just 22 at the time. This was back in 2019. He pulled over Johnson for a seatbelt violation, and Garriga argued that Johnson was actually reaching for a weapon at the time, and his family argued that body cam footage showed no evidence of that. And their attorney said that Johnson's autopsy didn't show the bullet trajectory matching Garriga's story. But the state attorney's office, they ruled that he was actually justified in the shooting against Johnson. So we're familiar with that case. We're also understand that he was involved with the Lakean Woods story as well. We know that viral video, that viral mugshot of him showing with swollen eyes and just badly beaten by police during a situation there. And then I'm familiar with your story as well. When you were at First Coast News, you did reporting about the text messages because he was also a member of the gang unit at the time. And there were several, I believe, racial insensitive messages, homophobic messages that he was involved with in this group chat. And it's something important to point out. He's been cleared in all of these cases. And I think some people feel that maybe they're saying, okay, this guy has been in the news over and over again. Here he is. What's going on?
Mm-hmm. Emily, is there a sense that, even though those various investigations did clear him, as Anthony says, that those might have amounted to some kind of a red flag?
At this point, there are a lot of questions that will come out of this, because if there's a consistent pattern, then maybe that where there's smoke, there's fire. The state attorney's office cleared him in that case, and so you have to trust their judgment. The same thing with Lakean Woods, and so it's hard to say. I don't want to weigh in on it honestly because it's dicey.
Yeah, I know, Nate, that the sheriff has been asked about whether he was allowed to continue to work while this investigation in Clay County was happening on these allegations. They were fairly recent allegations. They came, I think, in early March from this girl's mom who found these exchanges. And I think, to be fair to JSO, they're not allowed to tip off an officer if he or she is under investigation for some sort of, sex crime. So probably protocol would require this officer to continue to patrol as he did.
Right, and yet there is still this issue that somebody who, at minimum, has credibility issues is on the street and, is a member of what JSO kind of thinks of as an elite gang unit, making arrests. As Anthony referenced, in the Jamie Johnson case, Jamie Johnson was pulled over on a pretextual traffic stop. So pulled over because Garriga claims he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. Of course, the body camera shows he's wearing a seatbelt. Those are the kind of cases where the credibility of the officer really matters. And part of the fallout of this, I do think, is going to be revisiting some of the arrests that Garriga was a part of and taking another look at them.
Garriga had been back in the headlines for the Jamie Johnson case late last year, because there was a lawsuit that was settled, and the sheriff was pretty unhappy about that settlement. It was a $200,000 settlement the city agreed to pay the family of Jamie Johnson. And the sheriff said at the time that settlement made the agency look bad.
I would say he and his kind of mouthpieces at the agency said a lot more than that. I mean, they said that the settlement caused, in their words, profound reputational damage that could not be calculated. They spoke in a very indignant tone about the Jamie Johnson settlement. And, you know, I saw the sheriff give a couple of interviews yesterday, and, you know, this my impression. I'm a columnist. I get to have impressions and share them. I think you could be forgiven for thinking that the settlement made them angrier than this Garriga case does. I mean, I did not sense in the sheriff's tone the sense of indignation and outrage that they spoke about the settlement with. And he should be outraged about this for many reasons, one of which is that Officer Garriga made the sheriff look like a fool.
AG, your take on this? I mean, the sheriff did say yesterday he, thinks this case tarnishes the badge, that it's a terrible thing he doesn't want to ever see happen. We need to be clear. This officer is innocent until proven guilty. These are just charges. But he is being held on a significant bond in Clay County.
All right, correct. And, kind of tying this together, I mean, when you look at an officer like this who's got a history of going rogue, you've got a sheriff that, is more objecting to the settlement than to the actual actions thereof. It does create an optics issue. And if you look at what happens regarding, our sheriff's offices in the state, we had legislation basically this year that, moved that gave the sheriff more budget authority, sponsored by 2 Jacksonville people, this applying strictly to Jacksonville. The lack of, citizens review boards, things like that, that's banned now. So basically there's little recourse, and there's little way for actual citizens to speak out against officers like this who went rogue. I mean, Rep. Angie Nixon, people like that, activists that basically say we've been talking about Garriga for a long time. But nobody's been listening. And the fact is that sheriff's offices are insulated from criticism in a way that obviously is not productive, as this case shows.
And I want you to remind us about that budget change, because that does create a fairly, impenetrable in terms of, how resources are allocated in the sheriff's office, gives the sheriff much greater authority. Explain what that change was and how that impacts his budget. Yeah,
basically it takes any proposed budget when that's actually approved by the city council can be changed at any time with money moved from sub funds to do whatever the sheriff wants to do with it. There's very little recourse for lawmakers to do anything about it. They could theoretically have him in front of the finance committee and say, hey, sheriff, why did you move this money? But whatever he does with it, it's legal. And this is basically a way that lawmakers in Tallahassee, supermajority Republican dynamic in the legislature, have decided to elevate sheriffs to, having greater authority than arguably any other elected official in the state.
Anthony, it was interesting this week because one of our colleagues, or, at Channel 4, an anchor there, Vic McLucci, is going to take a role that is very much a community engagement role with JSO. Does a case like this just speak to that difficulty? I mean, that there is kind of this communication with the community that sometimes is fractured over issues of conduct by law enforcement officers.
I definitely believe so. And, it's interesting you mentioned that one of our colleagues who will be taking that position, I believe his role is going to be to strengthen the relationship between the community and police. And I know that's something that we're even working on right now with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. We were actually able to get an interview with Sheriff T.K. Waters live on television yesterday during our 5 o'clock newscast, because that's what people want. They want that transparency. They want to hear from the sheriff during situations like this to tell us a little bit more about, what's going on in our community. Why are things like this happening? Why do we have an officer who's been involved in so many different situations who continues to just be involved in different, I don't want to use the word controversial, but difficult situations? Why does this keep happening over and over again? And I think it's important that that information is shared with the public in a true and transparent form, and that we get the most information that we can possibly pass on so we can explain the situation, why this keeps happening over and over again.
But Emily, the sheriff's office has kind of changed the way that they communicate with the public and with the press. And I think that there's, I think maybe a more formatted communication in many cases. There's a lot of kind of pre-taped interviews that the sheriff does with one of his own staffers on subjects, almost, circumventing media in some cases.
My experience has actually been this is the best access we've had to the sheriff's office. In years past, it was, one gatekeeper and good luck. And, we did not see Sheriff Williams very much at all. I think that Sheriff Waters puts himself out there far more often, at least for access for us, doing interviews, does far more one-on-one sit-downs. What is the perfect world? What is the perfect answer? I don't know. In this situation particularly, whether this officer has been cleared or not, the optics certainly aren't good. There have already been calls to question cases he was involving in from Gundy, Pastor Gundy, Reverend Gundy.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, saw that email last night calling for them to look into that. But when it comes to the optics and the availability to the media, that's critical because you don't have the oversight or the accessibility for the public before. And I think, comparative to the previous administration, if you want to call it that, the previous sheriff, this is a far better situation.
I wouldn't disagree in so far as the Public Information Office, I think, has become much more responsive, available. There's more people working that office. And I think that in a lot of cases, they are proactive about trying to answer questions. But Nate, as you well know, there's still a lot of roadblocks to access, particularly in some cases when it comes to public records.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like substantive transparency, the JSO is as bad as it's ever been. I mean, if you ask for like substantive real documents from that office, if you try to get, the sheriff's emails, I mean, you're looking at an extended timeline, probably some sort of ridiculous fee. I mean, in that sense, it's as much of a black box as it ever was. It's good that the sheriff, is more willing to sit down, but that's not the full measure of what transparency is. And sitting down and not giving good answers, I would say, is also, a potential issue. Like, it's certainly performative transparency, but I don't know that the substance is really there.
Interesting. Well, I want to move on to another topic. We are talking about the big headlines of the week with our Friday panel of journalists this week. We're talking to Anthony Austin, A.G. Gankarski, Emily Turner, Nate Monroe. You can join the conversation as well. Give us a call at 904-549-2937 or send an email to firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. You can also comment on the program live stream right now. It's on Facebook and the WJCT YouTube page. Say nice things. Nate, I want to move on to a different topic, the financial impact of the JEA criminal case. This is an issue you've been reporting on for some time, but you updated your reporting this week. Tell us about the cost that the defense of these two ousted executives has incurred.
Yeah, so many years ago, this predates Aaron Zahn's time at JEA. The utility acquired what's called D&O insurance, directors and officers insurance, and this is, in and of itself, a fairly standard policy that you see in corporate America. It indemnifies the board members and officers of the company from being sued or for litigation costs over what are called wrongful acts. That's a broad term, but it's a defined term in the policy. Now, the kind of weirdness about this is that wrongful acts are not supposed to include deliberate fraud. That it's not supposed to include crimes. And so JEA was a few years ago very much objected to the idea that their insurance company had begun fronting the defense costs for Aaron Zahn, the former CEO, and the former CFO, Ryan Wanamaker. They had been fronting some of Zahn's expenses related to some civil litigation that he was involved in, but even after his indictment by a federal grand jury on fraud and conspiracy charges, the insurance company continued to front this money. And so, this is not I do not believe this is a final tally, but through February, the JEA's insurance company, so not ratepayers, but JEA's insurance company has fronted almost $9 million in defense costs for these two executives.
And the JEA officials that are there now had objected because they didn't think that their insurance policy should cover something that was a crime.
Right, and even before their indictment, JEA's position, and they're suing Aaron Zahn actively for allegedly defrauding the agency. So they considered Zahn's actions to be fraud, which are also not supposed to be covered by this policy. Now, the insurance company's position on this is, look, they had not yet been convicted in any court. Ryan Wanamaker was, of course, acquitted earlier this month, but Aaron Zahn was convicted. And so I think the question going forward is, how is that going to change the insurance company's posture? They do, I believe, have the right to claw back the money that it fronted Mr. Zahn. And so I'm sort of interested to see if they consider the conviction a final enough disposition of the case to say, yes, you were not eligible for this.
Yeah. And AG, as Nate says, this is the insurance company that is paying this, not ratepayers. But there is always a risk anytime you make an insurance claim that you could jack up your rates going forward.
Yeah, you could. And, it's an interesting, paradox here because, Zahn's actions, they wouldn't have happened if the JEA board at the time hadn't installed him. And Nate and I were in the room when they made that vote, and they discussed the candidates, and there were more qualified candidates who were being considered at the time, who basically were ignored in favor of Zahn. I think the board chair at the time cited his passion, things like that. Now, of course, none of the board people are saying they knew what was going on, but if you're following the headlines at any point in that, multi-year cycle, you would have known that JEA was on the block to be sold. You would have known that FPL was the likely buyer. You would have known that Aaron Zahn was there as an agent of the privatization agenda pursued writ large by the Lenny Curry administration. These things are known. So, in that context, it's arguable that the insurance should cover that because, after all, it was JEA's decision to put Zahn in a position where he could do that in the first place.
Interesting. So they enabled that fraud or crime such as it were.
Yeah, it might have been dysfunctional. It might have been an incompetent board. Might have been people who shouldn't have been anywhere near utilities decision-making process. But the fact was they were there. They were duly installed. They were appointed. They were vetted by the city council at the time. So this is JEA's baby.
Yeah. And Emily, the cost to this agency outside of, insurance rates or what their insurance company is paying has been huge. What we know of that, was money spent on many consultants, many lawyers that were hired to facilitate this process, or in some cases, as we've seen, hired and then kind of siloed out of the actual process. But that's a lot of money. That is not something that insurance is footing. That is something that, goes to ratepayers ultimately.
Yeah, and I think when you couple that with whether rates are going up, they just had a meeting about that this week. For the average person, you see these headlines, you see these expenditures, and then all of a sudden your bill is crazy. Like last summer, my bill jumped significantly when they changed the way they were doing their monthly fees. It makes you pretty upset. And so I can understand why people have some really hard questions for JEA and then specifically the board. That's kind of the process with these independent agencies in the city, is that the board is appointed and it has to be approved, and then it's up to them. It's incumbent upon them to have this responsibility to be good stewards of said agency. And in my experience with multiple different agencies, there's a big question on whether they're doing that well, whether it's, what's happened at the Housing Authority, the stuff I've covered with the Jacksonville Transportation Authority, JEA. There are some real questions there about this accountability process.
Yeah, it's an interesting structure, and it does leave a lot of that up to the goodwill and the interest and the initiative of these essentially volunteer boards. Anthony, are you hearing what Emily was talking about in terms of community pushback or anger over the rate increase, with any sense that it is, the JEA cost, the attempted sale was part of that, need for additional funds.
Exactly. And I understand exactly what Emily is saying when it comes to pushback about that, because when you're looking at your bill and you're seeing the price continue to go up, it's kind of what is happening here. And then we see situations like this where your top executives have been accused of fraud. I read Nate's article about this, and I believe Wanamaker had 2 attorneys in the courtroom. He had 2 attorneys before the pretrial. Then you had Zahn, who had 3 attorneys with him. And then he also had some other officials who were hired as part of this insurance situation. And just to see that happening over and over again, and then you have people in the community who are struggling, as is, to pay these electricity bills, and you see what's going on with JEA, it raises questions.
Yeah.
Well, can I just pop in? The other part of this is, regardless of how your revenue streams are dictated, we're not CPAs, we don't see the accounting of it, but the optics, again, are that this is has been a very expensive process for JEA. But in addition to that, recently, everybody got raises. And a lot of these people live out of town. And so if you're, somebody who's living paycheck to paycheck and your rates are going up and you're like, but these people who are making these decisions, whether they're on the board or whether they're an executive or whatever, they're making a lot of money. The math doesn't add up to, from the optics of it.
Yeah. And Nate, do we know kind of where we are? Is there any sense overall of what this cost the community in terms of, just all of those various agencies? And I know that you've done, a lot of records requests and looking at the billable hours and stuff, but is there any global sense as to what the price tag was
For privatization?
for the failed sale?
Yeah, I mean, it's a moving target in some ways, and some of it depends on, if you count Aaron Zahn's fight against the Plant Vogel purchase power agreement as sort of part of the privatization push that makes it more expensive. I feel like I looked at this a few years ago, and in between all the different consultants and the Vogel litigation, I mean, I feel like it was fairly close to $20 million.
Wow.
It was a lot of money. Now, some of that, I also do remember there was a time where the Office of General Counsel was considering whether they would, in fact, pay some of the legal bills that had been racked up and some of the outside law firms. But yeah, I mean, it was a big number. It was like between 13 and 20 million, depending on what you wanted to sort of consider as part of privatization.
We've got a call, Eugene on the north side. Good morning. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning, all, and happy Easter weekend.
Thank you.
I'm not a native of these parts, and this city, and I applaud Mr. Monroe for his research on this JEA situation. But to make my point, there was a saying when I first came here: if you don't like what you see and what's going down, go back to where you came from. And it seems as if sometimes the city want to drop that concept off, but they want to keep it at the same time. And I just think that going into the Aaron Zahn situation, I don't want to call any names out, but had we had a different mayor, all of this stuff would have been walked right through, and they'd be saying he's a jolly good fella down at the council, and it's a mess. And the same thing with the sheriff office. Until someone step up to the plate and deal with these issues like this, Jacksonville is going to stay where it's at and where it's been.
Thanks, Eugene. Appreciate your comments. AG, I want to carry this forward to talk about the police union reporting that you've been doing. You did a story this week for Florida Politics. The Jacksonville Police Union, the Fraternal Order of Police, is calling on Mayor Deegan's office, saying that she's maybe dragging her feet on negotiations for salary increases. Tell us about that.
Right. Fraternal Order of Police head Randy Reeves said that Donna Deegan wanted to expedite labor negotiations. But, what it comes down to is they've been waiting for a counteroffer to police union for a couple months now. The police union wants some heavy raises. 27% over 3 years for officers, for judicial officers, and 40% over 3 years for correctional workers. And all these people, compared to other officers in the state, are underpaid compared to St. Johns County, compared to the big counties nearby. And this is an interesting predicament for the Deegan administration because obviously law enforcement did not back Donna Deegan in the mayor's race. They were with Daniel Davis, the unions and the sheriff both. And you remember the sheriff was all over television for Daniel Davis last year. So this is an interesting gambit. There's not much for Donna Deegan to gain here because you've got Republicans and you've got the state police union and all of that saying that, yes, Jacksonville officers need to be paid more. But even if Deegan does come through and fulfill this entire request, which is not going to happen, I mean, it always happens with the police union asking for a lot more than they end up getting. She's not going to get any political benefit out of this. Come 2027, she won't be endorsed by the police union. She won't be backed by the sheriff. So this is something that can only hurt this mayor. And, obviously, we saw Lenny Curry deal with the police union with negotiations regarding the pension reform and his own salary raises and all of that. And, those guys play hardball. I think with Mayor Deegan, FOP is going to play hardball. They're going to keep the pressure on, and they're going to compel the mayor's office to probably give them more of a raise than Daniel Davis would have. The price of doing business, is going up because you don't have that political ally in the mayor's office. So it's an interesting dilemma. You've got a lot of these free market Republicans who are now pro-union. They sound like Billy Bragg out there. It's sort of an opposite day thing. But, I'm watching this. I'm curious to see where it goes. But, one thing to keep in mind with these negotiations, the public sector unions always play hardball. They always create drama, and they always make their case very evocatively. But, when it comes down to the numbers, Jacksonville cops make less than they do in other places.
She's basically writing the attack ads against herself as we speak, because when she was running for mayor, one of the biggest attack ads was, she was anti-police. She was at all of the Black Lives Matter protests, whatever. And she came out pretty strongly against those in interviews saying, no, I am pro-police. And then she, in a show of goodwill, authorized money to hire more officers, et cetera, et cetera. And so she's, got to put her money where her mouth is if she's saying she's pro-police. And so if any time you're going to drag your feet or you're not going to, it doesn't matter kind of what she does, whatever she's not doing, they're going to use that against her when a Republican runs against her next. And that will be just the next attack at however she handles this. And so whether they're taking more time to do due diligence or whatever, the message that it's sending via the FOP anyway is that maybe she's not as pro-police as she said she was.
Nate, you sat through some of those negotiations in the past between administration officials and the FOP, and they can be, some intense negotiations. How significant do you see this? I mean, ultimately, we're talking about a delay of about a month, according to what the FOP president sent out, that she'd promised, I think, by the 27th that she was going to have an offer or some information, and now that's been pushed back to late April.
I mean, this is just theatrics. I mean, there's nothing unusual about this timeline. I actually even think the Deegan administration has begun these negotiations before they needed to. I think she started this stuff earlier than she was legally obligated to. So, I mean, this is just as my colleagues here have kind of said, like, this is just posturing. It's an effort to get leverage. I mean, Donna Deegan could pay for Maseratis for everyone on the force, and she will be called anti-cop when she runs for re-election. I mean, there's literally nothing she can do to alter that. She has no, as AG said, no kind of political benefit here. This is really just a kind of a pain in the fiscal butt kind of problem. And, if the city council wants this bad enough, the FOP, declare impasse, let the city council sort this out, and then let the city council pick what in the general fund is not going to get funded because they wanted to give a 27% pay raise to police. Let them sort it out.
Anthony, this comes at an interesting time. I mean, there is no question, according to at least the analysis that have been presented and that AG's reported on, that these officers are getting paid less than other, comparable metros, surrounding counties, state average. Some of the biggest disparities are with correctional officers, which have right now they're seeing attrition rates of 35%. Their starting salaries are in some cases lower than people who are working at a Buc-ee's. So that's something to consider as we're talking about building a new jail, one that might be bigger and possibly even more demanding in terms of the number of people required to work there.
It's interesting that you bring up corrections officers, and because I just received an email probably a week ago from a corrections officer who has to remain anonymous, who is actually asking that I look into their salaries right now and also the staffing at the jail, because they feel that they are understaffed right now and they're not being given the resources that they need to do their jobs properly. So, I was going to touch on exactly what Emily just mentioned. We saw those ads while Donna Deegan was running for mayor with the sheriff and them saying that she, at the time, was not going to support police. So I think something, and I agree with what Nate says as well. I don't think this is something that she necessarily needs to rush to do, but I think they do need to come out, the Deegan administration, and say what they're going to do, give us a little bit more detail about what they're doing to help our officers, our corrections officers right now during this time, because I think they want that information to say, like I said, they're asking me for help right now.
Right.
They need something, and they need to know what our city leaders are doing for them.
Ask Anthony. It's always a good place to get answers.
Exactly.
We've got a call, Linda from Mandarin. Good morning, Linda. Welcome to First Coast Connect.
Good morning. Good morning. I wanted to just correlate all of the discussions we've had this morning have had a thread of crime and how different people have taught or how they handle things. Aaron Zahn gets $9 million, maybe cost and help for fraud from an insurance company, yet, they want to give 27% increase to the police. I would like to suggest that we actually have a performance evaluation, maybe have less bloated management who are all making six figures, push that down to the people actually on the front lines doing the work, and have high recidivism officers who are constantly in the news with potential issues have to get personal liability insurance. Because guess what? The city's insurance pays when we have to do a payout to that family. It was insurance. And then we get passed on to us. So those officers, back in originally when police officer unions were founded, officers had to carry personal liability insurance. These high-risk officers, they need to be responsible and have an umbrella policy if they're going to keep abusing the system. Just think about it, guys.
Thanks, Linda. Appreciate the call. I don't know who wants to take this, but I mean, this issue of officer attrition is something that came up under the Curry administration in 2017 when they decided to switch new hires from a defined benefit, a pension, traditional pension, to a 401k system. And everybody the police union and people in the community that were sort of allies of law enforcement said, look, this is going to be a problem. People get into law enforcement because they want some of that stability and knowing that after doing 20 years of a very difficult job that they're going to have a reliable pension. Anthony. Oh, AG, sorry.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, if you look at it, I mean, you've got serious attrition. You've also got people not wanting to take the jobs. I mean, the corrections officers are their class of 50, I believe. Their last one only had 11 people in it.
Wow.
So that can't make up for the attrition. You're going to have more people than that quit. And, you just can't get people to take jobs at these rates. During the mayor's race, there's discussion about putting cops and fire back on Florida retirement system. That's something that people were talking about in 2017. It's something that, there was idea of exploring it, but I'm not seeing the exploration now. The defined contribution plans, or the plans that they have now, basically are political losers. And they are not recruitment tools. So it's like FRS is probably the way to go if you're wanting to, stop the bleeding in terms of, police, corrections, judicial officers. But, getting the political appetite there and combined with the kind of raises the FOP wants, that's a heavy lift, especially with all the other things that the city wants to do, the jail, the stadium, and so on.
Nate.
And there's a sort of odd dynamic at play here, too, that The FOP, like its national counterpart, has become an incredibly partisan organization. And so like locally, this plays out. The FOP is sort of very close with this kind of Republican political establishment, and yet it is that establishment that took their pensions away. And if you consider the kind of lost income, retirement income for future generations of officers, I mean, you can make a case that was the largest police defunding effort ever in the city and very possibly nationally. I mean, Jacksonville is one of the only cities of any significant size that doesn't offer its municipal employees, including police, any kind of pension. So it's funny in a sort of an odd way that like Donna Deegan is the one that's got to carry this like anti-cop flag from her, because of her critics, but like she's not the one who took their pensions away. It's the politicians that the FOP typically supports are the ones who were responsible for that.
The defunding the police is kind of an interesting frame I had not thought of. Emily, this is something that, the mayor, as we've said, may not have any political benefit for her, but I think that just in her communications with the community, I think that she does very much try to communicate that she cares about public safety. She cares about law enforcement. Aside from the union, I think that she would probably tend to do some messaging in terms of making sure that law enforcement in this city is not radically underpaid relative to surrounding counties.
I mean, that's going to be, I think, the crux of this negotiation moving forward is, however you feel politically about this, the numbers are the numbers, and they're understaffed, and we're losing people, and the jail is, it's critical. I took a tour of it a couple months ago. I mean, they're working mandatory overtime. It's a mess. It's hard. And so, regardless of the politics, she's going to have to make moves to stem the bleeding, and I mean, it's going to have to be money.
Right. Well, I want to move on now to a topic that has gotten a lot of headlines nationally as well. This issue of social media. Florida banning social media for young teens entirely. The governor was in town on Monday signing this bill into law. It bars kids under 14 from using social media apps like Snapchat and TikTok. Emily, this is one of the most restrictive social media bans in the country. What is the expectation of whether this will be enforceable or legally withstand challenges?
I mean, I think that's the big issue. One, that it's going to be challenged in court. Every tech company that's affected is going to throw all of their copious dollars at this to fight it. Two, what are the teeth? I don't know what the person next to me is doing on their phone. How are you going to determine that? And, okay, so you try to set up a account and you have to like put in the year you were born or whatever, like they do on some of the alcohol sites. I mean, is that, you don't know who's on the other side of a computer or the mouse or the keyboard. Unequivocally, the research is there. Social media is damaging to children. But the question is this really just, kind of more of a move to say, oh, we think this is bad, versus something that's actually going to affect any change?
Anthony, this is something obviously that, blossomed up in the legislative session and isn't, new in the country, but this was, a very important issue for Paul Renner, who, was local to this area. It was the third bill introduced in the House, so it had some priority, and people in Tallahassee are very much engaged on the subject of the harms that are being done to kids by social media.
I think that's a good question, Ann, and I think a lot of parents will tell you this is something that they would like to see. They probably want their child on social media less, but once again, how do you enforce this? And how do you, we know kids can be sneaky. Is this actually going to bring forth any change at all?
Yeah.
That's the question that remains. And I know AG can probably answer just kind of what's going on in the legislature.
Yeah, AG, what is your sense of whether this is more of a political maneuver or something that is just a reflection of concerns when nobody has a solution.
Yeah, I mean, this is very much a real priority of Paul Renner's, like you mentioned. And, there was legislative appetite for this. The governor vetoed a version of the bill, so they passed a second try that they think will be compliant legally, that will stick, as the governor likes to put it. He's conscious, obviously, of many of the laws that he's advocated, suffering problems in courts. This whole thing raises a question to me, though, of parenting. I mean, why is the state assuming a parental function? And that's what this comes down to when I look at it. And it's part of a larger sort of thing in the DeSantis era where the state is expected to do more and more in terms of regulating the environment for kids. You see what they've done with schools, for example, with the content curation in schools, the marginalization of alternative perspectives, and so on. So this is a piece of that, but I don't know if it stands up in court. I don't know where the Supreme Court of the United States would go on it. I think I have an idea where the Florida Supreme Court would, but it does raise issues of civil liberties. It does raise issues of First Amendment protections. It raises a lot of constitutional issues that this legislature and this governor have gleefully waded into over the years.
Nate, it's interesting. I mean, there is, theoretically, there is already a federal law that prohibits kids under the age of 13 from, accessing most major platforms. It was the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, passed in 1998. And it was updated, about 10 years ago, but it doesn't seem to have had any effect. And that's a federal law for kids under 13. I don't think anybody thinks kids under 13 are not accessing TikTok and Instagram.
Right. Well, I mean, to AG's point, in some ways, I mean, this legislature, it's like anything to avoid addressing the actual problems they should be legislating about. I mean, this just, I'm incredibly skeptical that this is anything other than just theatrical, performative, culture war adjacent, just nonsense. And it probably is not going to survive a court challenge. It probably should not survive a court challenge. I certainly, as a parent, don't need Paul Renner and the clowns in the legislature telling me how to raise my kids. So, I would much prefer that they stick to issues like homeowners insurance and algae blooms and consumer protections, things that they actually should be concerned about.
So one thing that could withstand scrutiny is a proposal that came from a local school board member, April Carney. This week, she's a DeSantis ally, but she was at that press conference where he was, or at that event where he signed the bill, and she made an announcement of her own.
And that our children are not indoctrinated by these algorithms that are showing up 24 hours a day on our kids' phones. So as a parent, as a school board member, I am going to be putting forward policy here in Duval County that we no longer allow cell phones during the day.
So she is looking, Anthony, to mimic a law that they implemented, or a policy in Orange County Public Schools, bans cell phones for kids can't use them all day, including lunch. And this, she didn't end up introducing it this week. I think it's now been pushed to next month.
Right. This is interesting because I have a direct quote. I know we played that sound bite right there from her where she says, we're no longer going to allow cell phones during the day. Now, I know back in our day, we didn't have cell phones in school because they didn't exist at the time. But it is interesting to see her continue this. And as, of course, we know she is a supporter of Governor DeSantis. But it'll be interesting to see how this will play in this day and age of technology to not allow students to have access at all to their cell phones during the day. I think there will be some parents who might argue that because they want their child to have that privilege. And we understand that we don't want any extra distractions in the classroom, but I think that there are some parents that want their child to have their cell phones so they can have access to them.
Well, that's all the time we have. Nate Monroe, Emily Turner, Anthony Austin, A.G. Gankarski, thanks to all of you for being here today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And stick around. Up next, the soulful sounds of one rapper who...
Wayne Hogan of the Terrell Hogan Personal Injury and Wrongful Death Law Firm. Serious injury cases are complex, and civil trial attorneys present the evidence juries need to see and hear. More at waynehogan.law.
Understanding colorectal cancer. I'm Dr. Joe Servin. Join me tomorrow at 4 for What's Health Got to Do with It, only on WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville.
Baltimore mourns the loss of life and a symbol of the city.
It's shocking. The words that the Key Bridge is gone, it still shakes us.
Also, Florida passes a law banning social media for kids. Abortion is back before the Supreme Court, and under pressure from its own staff, NBC News cuts ties with former RNC chair Ronna McDaniel. More on the roundup next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Blue Sun as one of our favorite albums of 2023. But what made this album special to both of y'all? Ulysses, let's start with you.
So for me, I picked it because I knew it was an album that had been talked about a lot. But also, I'll just preface it with a jazz musician told me many years ago. He said, Ulysses, your generation wants to make a bunch of records because y'all want Grammy Awards. He said, and what you were reared on, the artists that you love, the John Coltrane's, the Miles Davises, he said they were into creating a body of work. And what excited me about what Andre 3000 did, it wasn't about an album. He was now creating a definitive body of work or adding to his body of work.
Yeah. Al, what about you?
It's been 17 years before that he hasn't released a body of work. Big Boy has done like endless albums. I think he's at number 5 and number 6 of his solos, and he's always present and representing from the Outkast. So for Andre to be this mystery, and be this regal hip hop artist, for him to present a flute album, you know what I'm saying? And this, I think we as hip hop artists forget sometimes that there are a body of work that need to be done, and hip hop came about being expressive. You know what I'm saying? So I commend him being in the space that he's in right now.
Ulysses, I wanted to ask you because New Blue Sun is drawing comparisons to spiritual jazz, and I want to ask you about that because to me, when I think of like Pharoah Sanders, like Themby, or Coltrane's Giant Steps, like the spirituality kind of comes out of this like interplay between groove and melody, and then the dissonance. New Blue Sun kind of it's ambient, and there it doesn't really have a lot of that dissonance in there. But is it jazz to you, Ulysses?
Well, man, this is such a long. So I'll just say this. One of my dear friends, she's a radio host in New York, Kiana Faircloth, shout out. And I was telling her about this interview that I was about to do with you and Al Pete. And she said, well, first of all, it's one long tone poem. That is what, like, it's a tone poem. And then the other thing she said, it's one long meditation. And I'll preface it before I answer it with another thing that someone told me. They said Erykah Badu spoke out and said, Andre said, y'all don't deserve words. And I think one thing Al Pete said, that so many things he said I agree with, is that Andre waited a long time, right? And part of his mystique is his patience and his silence. If we look at a lot of artists that changed the world, him, Sade, D'Angelo, they all took really long periods of time. So I think to your point about spiritual jazz, I think Andre wanted to let us know, like, yo, this is actually what y'all need right now. What I actually am reminded of is there's a Yusef Lateef record called Meditations. And what's interesting, if you listen to them like side by side, he has, I think, about 12 to 14 meditations. And you listen to Andre 3000, Andre's is basically a overproduced with some great hip hop production version of Yusef Lateef's record, because it's literally these themes.
Maybe one of the most interesting albums in a long time to like crack the Billboard charts, and so people did listen to this.
Despite.
I love it. Of course.
Yeah. So
of course.
Do you see this as like maybe having a broader impact than just being an album that we talked about in 2023?
I do. If anything, is what Ulysses said, it's definitely going to have artists, because that's the first thought I had. I was thinking, like, this is where I would like to be in my career, like to be so liberated like that. So if I want to be able to pick up a flute and just play how I want to play, if that expression comes to me like that, Andre 3000 definitely set the tone on that.
Yeah.
I think we're going to have a whole bunch of ambient records now, because that's another part of popular culture where everybody follows it. But to me, what Andre did, because he's so brilliant, he recreated a connection that was already there. And Al Pete, you know better than me with the evolution of hip hop. How did it start? It started with the MCs, obviously DJs, and the jazz musicians. Nas' father is a jazz musician. Like
First Coast Connect at WJCT.org. Today's program will be rebroadcast at 8 o'clock, and all of our shows are archived at WJCT.org and on your favorite podcast platform. Don't forget to listen Saturday at 4 when neurologist Dr. Joe Servin explores colorectal cancer with experts and survivors. The executive producer of First Coast Connect is David Luckin. Our producer is Stacy Bennett. Kathy Waterman is our associate producer, and our show is directed by Brady Corum. Join us again Monday when we discuss a new community home for adults with intellectual disabilities. I'm Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.